Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you, of course, to Gresham College and the British Society of History of Mathematics for the opportunity to speak here. I must say that the British Society of History of Mathematics, they're the friendliest and most productive group of folk I've ever come across. I'm going to be talking about the grand narrative of the history of computing. And really what we're asking is, what is the story we tell ourselves about how we got to where we are? Telling the story will allow us to locate the particular thread of automatic computation in the larger scheme of things and allow us to ask questions about, is it sustainable? Is it sustainable? What will it do? How can we locate smartphones, tablets in this long historical thread? We can then look at some of the core ideas, if there's time, look at some of the core ideas in modern computing and actually see where they might have come from. So the history of automatic computation is an emerging field. It's a bit like a rebellious adolescent in the sense in which it defies containment. What we're looking for is an aerial view. What we're looking for is an aerial view that will frame, that will give us some basis for looking at the meaning and understanding the countless local narratives that populate this tale. So what is it that strings them together? Although string, as we shall see, is an inappropriate way of looking at things. Despite the youth of the field, if we look at historical surveys, canonical textbooks, and popular histories, a clear narrative has emerged, despite the fact that the field is still changing and it's very difficult, actually, certainly, to frame modern developments. So what I propose to do is to give a very brief outline, just the arc of the narrative, and then look at how it's constructed. Is there some infrastructure that will give us some clues about how this narrative might evolve? Is it sustainable? Can it absorb these new developments? Or does it frizzle out like the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz when doused with a bucket of water? So, what is the grand narrative of the history of computing? It looks to its roots in early counting and number systems, and typically an account will start with Roman calculi, the pebbles that were used on counting boards. It then moves on to quipu, or knotted chords. Knotted chords, we can actually... Here we go. We can see those up there. These are knotted chords that were used for counting. That's a positional system of value, the position of the knot, the presence of the knot and the position of the knot actually gives the value of the thing. These go back very, very early on. Early antiquity and the dawn of time. These expressions historians use when they haven't a clue. So these go quite far back. These were used by Inca, American Indians, Incas, and were established quite prominently in the 15th and 16th centuries. We then find tally sticks. These are knotted sticks. And these go back, the earliest one of those is about 8,000 years old, and these are notches which again record number, but usually amounts usually of money. Now these were used in the exchequer for tax administration from the 13th century and was stopped, the usage was stopped in 1826, so they're relatively recent. Now the way it worked was you actually, the notches record the amount. It's either a deposit or a debt. And the notches record the amount. There's a code that allows you to have, and then you split this along its lengthwise to make two parts. So the knots appear in both halves, both sections. One is a thin bit and one is a thick bit. The thin bit is called a foil, after the French word for leaf, and the thicker bit is called the stock. Now the bank or the taxman keeps the thin bit, and the depositor or debtor keeps the stock. And the legacy of that is still in our use. We now talk about counterfoils and we talk about stockholders. So the legacy of that usage is still in our language. Some of these sticks were 1 to 2 foot in length. There may be an opportunity for the Financial Service Authority. The idea was that when you then had a new settlement or a new payment, you married the two halves, and if the notches were intact, then you were relatively assured that there hadn't been any forgery or fraud. And there may be an opportunity here for the Financial Services Authorities to actually introduce this again to prevent bank fraud. Although if I had a 2-foot stick and I was in a room with a banker, there are probably other things I could imagine doing other than cutting notches in it. So these are systems of counting. So it's curious. So what's important is that computing looks back and sees its origins in counting and number systems and various paraphernalia, the physical aids and artifacts to assist, relieve, or replace manual calculation. So we have other bits and pieces. The narrative then usually shifts from counting aids to devices with moving parts, and of course mechanical calculating aids. And the abacus here has unchallenged priority. There's the Japanese soroban and the Russian shoti. As with the keeper, they have positional systems of value, the position of the bead in the wire and bead frame, and so on. During the European Enlightenment, there was a surge in calculating aids. Analog devices with graduated scales for calculation and measurement were the mainstay of calculation in the 17th century and onwards. Quadrants, sectors, proportional compasses are some of these. I won't go into any detail in those. Napier's bones, 1617, we have an example there. There's nothing macabre in calling them Napier's bones. There's nothing macabre in it at all. They were called Napier's bones because the upmarket versions of these were actually carved in bone and not in wood, as this example shows here. And they were used for assisting in multiplication division. There were also specialized ones for doing things like square roots. Slide rules were the absolute mainstay of calculation for over 350 years. The logarithms were introduced early 17th century, and slide rules, of which there are countless varieties, were actually the mainstay. They became a badge, if you like, of office for engineers, and my generation of engineers always had slide rules. This was until they were entirely wiped out and achieved total obscurity in the early 1970s when electronic pocket calculators effectively wiped them out. And that last example is actually the slide rule I carried around as an engineer. So that tells you that I go back to biblical times. So the next chapter in the sequence is mechanical calculators, the beginnings of attempts to transfer human intelligence into mechanism, that somehow the algorithm, the rules of operation, were now incorporated in some way in the machine, in these cases only partial. So it starts off with, it's the 17th century, early 17th century, Schickard's calculating clock, which isn't here, the Pascaline, 1642, Blaise Pascal's calculator, and Johann Müller's universal calculator. So these were really objets de salon. They were paraded in front of the wealthy and the aristocracy. They were, if you like, philosophical novelties which stimulate a lot of debate about the possibility of automating machines and calculation, and if you like, mechanizing thought, but they weren't really suitable for practical use. Things changed, things get serious in about 1820 with the introduction of the de Colmar's arithmometer. That's a later version, but it was introduced in 1820. But it took nearly 60, 70 years before the arithmometer actually matured as a product. In the General Register Office by 1876, that's over half a century after the first introduction, there were still only 3 arithmometers in use. So it took a huge amount of time. The take-up of this product was actually very, very slow. And the implications of acceptance of innovation is something that we will be looking at. After that, Babbage is usually, we usually have a section on Babbage. These are manual calculators. What defines them as a class is that they require human intervention for the calculation to proceed. You have to enter the numbers by hand, you have to read them off, you have to transcribe the results, and so on. The algorithm is only partially incorporated. It usually does addition and carriage to a limited extent. But the actual complete algorithm, they're not automatic. They're manual in the sense that they require human intervention for the algorithm to proceed. The algorithm is still in the human. The big breakthrough, of course, is Charles Babbage, 1821, with his conception of automating this, and then that's followed very quickly by Herman Hollerith with the introduction in 1890 of his tabulating machines, his tabulators and sorters for the 1890 census. So we then have a seamless segue from Hollerith into the great office automation industry that Martin touched on earlier, of the early part of the 19th century. So this is punch card machines and desktop calculators, the celebrity devices, Burroughs, Felt, Baldwin, Brunswiga, Facet. These were the great mechanical calculators of the age, part of the office automation era. And then we have the ensuing boom in the computer industry over the last 80 years, which brings us, perhaps slightly breathlessly, to the present. So that's just a general sort of arc. It goes from calculi to smartphones, if you like, via these mechanical calculators, starting with counting and progressively trying to incorporate and replace more and more of human activity in this thing. So what are the implications of telling a narrative of this kind? Well, the serial nature of this tale suggests a single developmental thread. a kind of comforting form of evolutionary gradualism. The tale is essentially one of innovatory highlights, resembling welcome and cheerful progress. There is a tendency that because something succeeds in time, it is as a result of its immediate precedent. The idea of succession in time may imply causal connection. And do not mistake causal connection for succession in time for causal connection was what my tutor in philosophy of science told me in Cambridge. This is the post hoc, ergo propter hoc fallacy. This is a fallacy because it occurs later. It doesn't necessarily mean it occurred because of what immediately preceded. So telling the story in a linear way has perhaps an implication that there is a monocausal connection between events. Need is often posited as a historical cause. Looking backward through time, knowing how it turned out, it's quite easy to backwardly project need. Often needs were fictional. The idea is that there was a pre-existing need, often a critical need, even when the outcomes are unanticipated. Often these needs were created for rhetorical and political purposes. Babbage is known to have created the primary motive for Babbage's machines was supposedly to eliminate errors in printed mathematical tables. The infallibility of machinery would eliminate errors in tables, and this is supposedly, history tells us, is his primary motive. His actual motive, when one looks at his early writings, was in the theoretical potential of these machines, not in the utilitarian justification through tables. The utilitarian justification, the practical use of these machines to make error-free tables was almost retrofitted by Dionysius Lardner, a scientific publicist who needed to dramatize the story of Babbage's engines because the mathematics of the engine was actually too difficult for popular audiences. And he wrote to Babbage and say, how are we going to sell this thing? The mathematics is too difficult. Tell me about errors. So if you like, need. So the whole story, there's a problem. Problems are errors in tables. And the solution is Babbage's engines was actually a piece of rhetoric. It was fictionalized for political purposes. That doesn't mean to say it isn't good history. It is history. In fact, it's very intriguing. But the idea that we should not mistake the idea that all innovation was a satisfactory response to declared need. Now, seeing each innovation as a response to a pre-existing need eliminates the need for further inquiry, which means that a lot of things we should be looking at don't get looked at because simply we already have an account. So many techniques, devices, and processes were actually met with resistance. And when acceptance was the outcome, this was sometimes far from immediate and often very hard fought. The idea of the internal stored program, regarded as the defining feature of the modern computer, was met with puzzlement in some quarters when it was first introduced, was resisted in other quarters. And it's only retrospectively when we actually say, what is it that defines the modern computer? Well, it's the internal stored program. That this actually achieves the kind of historical prominence that it has. So we should not assume that all new innovation was in kind of replacement technology joyously received by these hard-pressed, suffering practitioners who were suddenly relieved of onerous toil by being rescued. And rescue narratives are actually quite prominent, and we'll see some of those. There are other features of historical change that don't sit comfortably with this model of relentless determinism. There's a tendency to admit long periods of dormancy, periods where nothing at all happens. And I mean, it's sort of said in a rather circular way. It's always the news that makes the headlines. Well, when nothing happens, you still need a headline. And we'll see how this has influenced the construction of the arc of this narrative that I've traced. Lateral cross-influence, whether explicit or implied. There's the bitter dispute about the priority of Eniac. John Mauchly was the co-designer of Eniac. Wartime American first attempt to use vacuum tubes for large-scale electronic calculation. And there was a court case about the priority of these patents because Mauchly had visited John Tanasoff at Iowa State University and seen the ABC computer, and the question was ENIAC based on Tanasoff's work? Was Mauchly influenced? And the court case was held in 1973, and the evidence is voluminous and conflicting, and the court ruled in favor of Atanesov and invalidated the ENIAC patents. So here we have a situation in which cross-influence is very difficult to determine historically. Was he or was he not influenced? The court ruled that he had been influenced, that the seeds of it were actually Atanesov's. But history, the story that history tells is quite unaffected by this court ruling. And in fact, a lot of issues of influence are actually nuanced below the level of documentation. And so court rulings are one thing, and actually what was going on is probably unresolvable. But that's a dispute that split the historical community, one of the most bitterest and unseemly disputes ever. The community was split, taking one or another's side, and was a huge, huge rift in the computing community. Finally, in serial narratives, there's a tendency to deselect parallel development. So when things are going on at the same time, you're telling a serial tale, there isn't place for everything. So, say at the same time X, Y, Z was going on, it actually interferes with the narrative. So there's a tendency to channel this narrative in a linear and serial way. Now, in music, we can follow multiple voices in harmonic sounds. Visually, we can actually apprehend, we can register more than one particular area. But it seems in language, it seems to be a feature of our cognitive apparatus that when we talk about language, which is both written and spoken, it needs to be serialized. It needs to be broken up and serialized. And it could be that the serial tale is actually an artifact of the medium. Chapter sequences need to follow one after the other. You can't read two chapters at the same time. So we perhaps shouldn't be too harsh on the popularizers of science in looking for a narrative made of headlines. But there may be something deeper at play here. The linear narrative may in fact be reflecting a presumption, conscious or unconscious, of technological determinism. The idea that the engine of change is technology, which then impacts society as though somehow isolated from it and not influenced by it. So, do machines make history, asks Heilbronn in a classic paper, or does history make machines? And we've got a way in which telling a serial narrative may in fact distort that picture. So, chronology as history, make no mistake, makes for very dramatic narratives, but we can see how it does perhaps a disservice to a richer historiography. Now, if we shift from this technocentric or innovation-driven model into a user-based model, then the landscape opens out, and we can actually produce a map that can address a more dimensioned map, a more nuanced map that can address some of the difficulties that I've outlined. So that's what I call the river diagram. And that identifies three distinct categories or trajectories of human activity. So if we put aside for a moment the material culture of these things and just look at the activities going on, then we have four threads: calculation, automatic computation, information management, and communication. And in sort of the 70s, in this fusion chamber of solid-state physics, or chip of integrated circuits, they all re-emerge and rebound in a bundle again. But if we look at these separate activities and then look at the material culture that's associated with them, then actually we can begin to deal with things like cross-influence. We can begin to... Now, okay. So in this scheme, desktop calculation starts with calculating all the rest and goes all the way through and ends perhaps with an epilogue of the electronic pocket calculator, in which four-function arithmetic becomes completely trivial to the point at which calculators are giveaways. They're software add-ons. You hit a button on your keyboard and you'll get a pop-up calculator. This isn't the primary purpose of the computer. So the point is the problem is solved. The big struggles with desktop calculation. The point is that what distinguishes this category of artifact is that they're portable or semi-portable. They require human intervention to operate. They deliver calculation at the point of need, and they're not automatic. So that is a class of physical objects and of human activity which is quite distinct, which would get lost if we're actually talking about a serial narrative made of headlines of innovation. There are a lot of artifacts that actually don't make the A-list, the innovations catalogue. And I don't mean by the innovations catalogue that thing came as a supplement to the Sunday newspaper in which you can buy a monogrammed coffee coaster that also acts as a compass. I'm talking about, if you look at the world first, the A-lists of innovation, there are a lot of things that affected very dramatically the mechanical culture of the day, the physical practice of the time, which actually don't make the grade. And we have a good example here, which is the Computator. It's a chain adder. It's a beautiful device. Hold in your hand, and what it will do is keep a running total of numbers entered with a stylus on those things. You can freeze it by operating the lever on the side, which means you can read intermediate results. Now, these were made in vast numbers, huge, very widely. They don't feature at all in the narrative. So there are a raft of minor devices which affected practice, daily practice, which live, if you like, in the shadow of the celebrity devices, which grab the headlines, which are the Brunsvigas, the facets, the Burroughs machines, and so on. There are many other devices of this kind. Now, if we then look at the next thread, which is automatic computation, which is the thread I'm trying to isolate, which we'll then give more particular attention to. The starting point there, okay, all these are manual, so there is a starting point. There isn't, in technological terms, an automatic device prior to Babbage 1821. Babbage is sitting there checking mathematical tables with Herschel. There are a lot of errors. He clasps his hand to his head and he says, I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam. Steam being a metaphor for the infallibility of machinery and also to solve the problem of supply through production. So the starting point of automatic computation is up there, 1820s, 1821, and it's a separate thread. But there's a huge gap. When Babbage died, or really from 1840s, 1850s onwards, not a lot happens in automatic computation. When Babbage died in 1871, the movement to automate mechanized thought, mechanized calculation, lost its most vigorous advocate and its most active practitioner. And then nothing happened till about the 1930s, when Comrie revived some of those techniques. And Comrie talks about the 100 dark years in the history of computing, where nothing happened. Now, linear narratives don't deal well with big gaps. So what fills the gap? Okay, so we need something to fill the gap. So what time serial narratives don't do well is deal with issues of that kind. Information management. The practices go back to record keeping. The kipu and the tally sticks are actually not just, they're medium of record. They're ways of managing information and have very little computational capability. So there's a fundamental distinction between information management and automatic computation. It's largely to do with emphasis. Information management systems are things that have vast data throughput, relatively moderate and sometimes non-existent computational ability, and automatic computation is computation intensive, doesn't necessarily handle a lot of data. So it is a justifiable separate thread, both in terms of the human activity involved and also in terms of the machinery, the material culture that's associated with these. Communication has its own rich traditions and is slightly out of our remit here, but it goes back to telegraphs, semaphore telegraphs, all that sort of stuff, and is a very significant part of the mergence, the convergence over there into the electronic information age, but we're going to leave that aside. Now, if we look at the standard chapter sequence in the arc that I told you about, it started with prehistory, with Kipu and pebbles and all that stuff, and then we have mechanical calculus, and then Babbage is the big thing. Then we have Hollerith straight afterwards, because that's 1890s, he died 1871, 1890s. We then get the electronic era, the semiconductor era, and broken down, and so on. Now we can see immediately that this serial narrative has been spliced from segments taken from different threads, which have neither traditional connections nor artifactual functional connections. So they involve different activities, they involve different categories of artifacts associated with them. So the way we've constructed the narrative is actually take pieces out of each of these, whichever was the innovatory highlight of the time, and create a serial narrative. And I'd say that is how, if you like, the underlying construction of this. Now we can overlay time bands on this. We can overlay time bands, you can use generation, you can have various overlays on this, you can look at mechanical, you can look at generational technology, the mechanical era, electromechanical era, electronic era, and so on and so on. You can overlay that onto those things and see how these narratives are constructed. So we can deal with parallelism. The fact that something was going on in automatic computation here doesn't mean to say that the quest for a desktop calculator stopped, although it may drop out of the story we're telling. We also shouldn't be to take these vertical bands too literally. If we look at yes, here we have the holograph tabulator and sorter, and that's the 1890s cover of Scientific American dealing with the use of the holograph tabulator in the 1890s. But we'll mention that, we'll come back to that presently. What we want to look at is the Courte calculator. Now, that's a handheld thing. It's like a little coffee grinder. It fits in the palm of your hand, and it's actually a circular arithmometer. Now, this thing was introduced in the 1940s and was used right through to the 1980s. So you can see that it's, in terms of its life expectancy, longevity, and utility and practical use, it actually spanned several of these generation technologies. So again, we have an issue where butt jointing, involving jump cuts from Babbage to holograph, for example, and then we're butt-ending stories which actually are not part of the same tale. The extreme example of bridging technologies, or a single device which bridged all these technologies, is the abacus. This is a version I brought back from Moscow in 1992. I went into a bread shop in Moscow, and next to the electronic till, there was an abacus. And I asked the guide what's going on here. And the guide said that country folk mistrusted the electronic calculator. Unless the change was worked out on the abacus, there was an argument or a dispute. I thought this was quite charming, and I took my camera out to shoot this cliched old and new image that is beloved of publicists and marketing people. And I thought I would take a photograph of the baker in his white outfit and this thing. And the shop cleared in 2 ticks. The shop evaporated. I mean, there were no customers left. I say it was a bread shop out of kind of social convention. There was no bread in the shop. There were just empty shelves, and there were lots of queues. And this was perestroika, which is during the dismantling of the state controls of supply of food. And I began to wonder, actually, whether it was a bread shop at all. So, where does this leave us in relation to material culture? What sustains the threads, if you like, since, I mean, you've heard perhaps from the introduction that, you know, material culture, being a curator, is actually looking at what can objects tell us about history. I would say their threads are actually sustained by the categories of artifacts that support them. And the point about it is that an arithmometer doesn't look like a speaking tube, and a telegraph doesn't look like a tabulator, and a telephone doesn't look like a fax machine. So the idea is that something that is functionally distinct is actually physically distinct. And that both sustains the threads and also allows us to categorize artifacts. So I believe that prior to the convergence, where all those things converge, if you were organizing a collection, you were sitting in a store and you had to label the shelves, is this communication, is this automatic computation, is this what? You would not have too many anomalies. You could resolve it by looking at it. So the phones don't look alike, but they're clearly communication devices, and they're clearly part of that class of telephones. They don't look like telegraph, the Wheatstone telegraph. So there are differences, and the differences are actually that have been respected. Now I'm going to show you a very alarming diagram. Oops. Which seems to have vanished. I don't understand where it's gone. No matter. It's a diagram about convergence. It's a very startling diagram. What it shows that threads is a kind of sausage, and it goes into kind of fusion chamber. And the fusion chamber is solid-state physics. This is where tens of thousands of transistors can be placed on a small little thing with submicron geometry. Now, to give you some idea of submicron, these are transistors which are smaller than a micron. To give you some idea of what a micron is the length your fingernail grows in about 10 minutes. That's how big these little devices were. So suddenly you have the opportunity of massive density of functionality, as the Americans call it, in a single device, and you could assimilate into a compound device all these multiple functions. So you can have an automatic computing device, all that stuff, all in one device. So you get this fusion chamber in the 70s, which, if you like, destroys the set of distinct categories that supported our threads. When I was developing these ideas, that was the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley, and I spoke about the collapse of categories. That once you hit this fusion chamber, where all these things converge, you get the collapse of artifactual categories. Material culture actually suffers a kind of breakdown. At the same time, Gordon Bell, who is famous for his contribution to the Digital Equipment Corporation and the dominance of the DEC mini-computers, he was there, and he was working at the same time. He's a trustee and a very active trustee of the museum. He was working at the same time in his work on the death of classes. I was talking about the collapse of categories as a way of trying to say, to develop a concept diagram for 2,000 years of history of computing. We were doing a computer gallery. I was the guest curator there. How do you tell the tale? What do you say about 2,000 years of history? So the idea was that you had this fusion chamber. After the Silicon revolution in 70s, 80s, you had this massive profusion of devices, of smartphones, which defied conventional categories. Up to that point, the conventions had been respected all the way back. And he was talking about the death of classes on the basis that the mini-computer was one of those proliferous devices, computing devices anywhere, and they ceased to exist. And so he was generalizing from mini-computers and mainframes and saying, what is it that defines a class? And can we say anything more general in a kind of robustly universal way about the longevity of classes? So something seems to be happened there in the 70s. Convergence, death of classes, and the collapse of categories. So is this the death of the grand narrative? If progress is what underpins the grand narrative, we'd say no, the smartphone is just another thing in the succession of artifacts. If it's a question of material culture, then I would say yes, it is the death of the grand narrative. So, what are the core ideas? We've now isolated the thread of automatic computation, and we can now look at its distinctive history, uncluttered, if you like, by the kind of interference, the noise interference from other threads in the way we tell the tale. So some of the core ideas in modern computing. Firstly, mechanical process, which we're going to talk about a bit more. Digital logic. Algorithms. Systems architecture, the internal organization of a machine. Software and universality. And the internal stored program. I'd say those ideas that are sort of picked out of a basket of many, which we'd say are uniquely or particularly modern. Let's say that, Turing was associated with many of them. So let's look at these in sequence. We're going to start with Charles Babbage, because that was the start of the automatic computation thread. We've said he had his epiphany in 1821. He was going to devote the rest of his life, he'd like, to mechanizing arithmetic. When he said, I wish to God these calculations had been, not when he said it, he said, I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam. And Peter Ackroyd, an historian and novelist, wrote in his book, The Limehouse Column, a novel, he said, that was one of the most wonderful sentences of the 19th century. I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam, because what it's capturing is the extension of the industrial metaphor to mental activity, from physical production to mental activity, and that's what it actually symbolized. So the first of his engines was difference engine number 1. This is a demonstration piece assembled in 1832. It's 1/7 of the whole engine. And so initial values are set by hand on these figure wheels. You crank the handle on the top. And the machine calculates automatically, and the result appears in the last column. So now the significance of this machine cannot be overstated. This is probably the most celebrated icon in the prehistory of computing. It's the first successful automatic computation device. That is to say, it's the first device that successfully embodies mathematical rule in mechanism. You crank the handle. You do not need to understand the principle on which it's based or the mechanism to get useful results. You get results which up to that point in time you could only get by thinking. You exert physical energy, you get results by thinking. Now the implications of this were not lost on Babbage and his contemporaries. Lady Byron saw the machine in 1833 and wrote in a diary, last week we saw the thinking machine, for such it seems. Harry Wilmot Buxton, a junior colleague of Babbage's, said that Babbage had replaced the marvelous pulp and fiber of the brain with brass and steel. Babbage had taught wheel work to think. And he adds, or at least to do the office of thought. At least to do the office of thought. So already at that stage, they were aware that brains weren't cogwheels. that what it is a machine did mechanically may produce the same outcome as a thinking process, but it wasn't doing what brains do. And we have, of course, Turing's great thing, the idea of mechanical process. What we mean by mechanical in the Turing-Newman sense is it's unthinking. And we use that now. We do something mechanically, we do it without thinking and repetitively. So mechanical in Babbage's terms was literal. It was cogs, levers, and ratchets and things. But there's a much deeper significance, which is actually articulated by Turing and Newman, and that is mechanical. That is, it removes what Turing did, we know, is he watched somebody do a calculation, and all he saw was marks on paper. And he said, if you put a machine to make the same marks on paper by rules, then you have mechanical calculation, which the point being, it does not presuppose higher orders of consciousness of human in order to do the calculation, which is what he meant by mechanical process. So you have mechanical process so that's the first of our ideas. Now, in broad cultural terms, we can see this as the extension of the industrial metaphor. And this was actually evident in language at the time, that the industrialization of thought is actually reflected in contemporary language. They spoke about a real manufactory of numbers, mechanical fabrication of tables, and emphatically a machine for manufacturing tables. So they were aware both of the industrial implications of what was happening, which was the culture of the times, and this reflected in the way they referred to these things. Now, next one is digital. What do we mean by digital? So here we have mechanical process. What do we mean by digital? Digital, Babbage's engines are decimal digital machines. They're decimal in the sense they use the familiar number system 0 to 9. They're digital in two ways. Firstly, if you want to represent a multi-digit number, you put units at the bottom, tens, hundreds, thousands, and you got it. So each digit in the number has its own figure wheel. So if you want to represent 2.5, you have a figure wheel with 5 at the bottom and a figure wheel with 2 above. A wheel between 2 and 3 is indeterminate, is logically indeterminate. It's not 2.5, it's actually a mistake. Now, these figure wheels are inherently analog devices. All the transitional states between 2 and 3 are stable. They can sit there quite indefinitely. So the question is, how can they be digital machines? And the answer is the security mechanisms that Babbage incorporated in them. They are digital only because Babbage's control mechanisms make them so. And I'll show you some examples of the techniques he used. That's from inside his first different, the 1832 version. And you can see there is a roller on a sprung lever. And you can see these hemispheres, which are the kind of teeth. We can look at it a bit closer. These are the hemispheres kind of teeth. Now, that's a sprung roller. As this tries to turn, you can see that it's biased so that that's sprung. It's trying to press in between the two cheeks all the time. And that biases the wheel in favor of one or another. Now, the dwell angle is actually too shallow for it not to actually perch on top. But if that was a triangle, you'd have the equivalent of a modern flip-flop, something which is stable one side and stable the other side, but the transitional values are not. And so this is mid-1820s design. You can see that the attempt to digitize, to discretize the emotion, to make it incremental in fixed jumps is actually completely evident here. Later he used more sophisticated devices. He used a wedge. If you imagine that as looking down on a column of figure wheels, there's a wedge, which is like a sword blade, which runs the entire length of the columns, and that goes between the teeth of the thing, which stops it. Now, if the tooth deranges, the lock, which is what he called them, will hit the end of the tooth and the machine will jam. So the jamming is not a calamity, the calamity it would appear to be. The jamming actually is error detection. It says a wheel is in an logically indeterminate position. The integrity of the calculation has been compromised. And those locks perform three things. As they enter, they make small error corrections. If they're locked in place all the time, they prevent the wheels deranging during periods which they're not needed. And finally, they're a form of error detection, that if there's a tooth derangement, then the machine will jam and let you know. And Babbage boasts, he says that the machine will jam or break but never deceive. That was his confidence in his mechanisms. That is actually a video of the lock working, but I don't think there's time for it. You can see the lock there is that vertical saw blade. That's the wedge-shaped edge, and it's going into a series of racks which are triangular, which act more like a flip-flop. The error correction, as it goes in, it corrects small derangement. It's like pulse shaping in modern electronics. It cleans up a jagged edge of a degraded pulse. So we've got mechanical process, we've got digital. Now we need to go to the next one, which is from calculation to computation. The difference engine is what we'd call a calculator. It only had a specific set of functions, and it crunched numbers the only way it knew how, according to the method of finite difference. Whatever initial values you put in your crankdown, it'll do the same thing to them. You couldn't alter what it did to the numbers. To get general purpose computation, we need to be able to alter the rules by which the information is manipulated. And the next leap, actually that's when Babbage said it would jam, break, or never deceive, he was right. That's difference engine number 2, never built in Babbage's day, completed 2002 at the Science Museum. That's 8,000 parts, 5 tons, and it works. That's the back of it, not because I have time, but just because I couldn't resist it. Okay, so it's the analytical engine, conceived in 1833, that actually marks the transition from calculation to computation, to general purpose computation. And that's the next step in automation. Digital automation is the one step. The next step is actually to generalize this. And here we have, those are, right, one of the point about the analytical engine, one of the things is it was programmable using punch cards. And there were various kinds of punch cards. One set of punch card was an operations card, which holds the instructions. Another kind of card was a variable card, which tells you where the information is to be placed into memory. And those are 2 examples. We have an example of operation card. That is a set of just under 30 cards, which solves simultaneous differential equations, second-order simultaneous equations, and those are variable cards. Some of these cards are 26 inches in length, so they're quite big things. So here we have the algorithm has now been transferred to the operations cards. The machine operates without human intervention, it's automatic, and it is general purpose in that it's programmable. That is an 1840s plan, Plan 25 of Babbage's of the analytical engine. Now just to give you some idea of physical scale. So Babbage bursts out of nowhere like a historical jack-in-the-box and confounds us with schemes of a logical conception and physical scale that were unprecedented. The diameter of those central wheels, so if you imagine each of these circles is a column of wheels 30 to 50 deep. So we're looking at it from the top and those go into the page. The diameter of that is nearly 5 to 6 feet, 15 feet high. The diameter across there is 8 feet. That lot's 15 foot high. That is the memory over there. This is the central processor over here. The memory is a linear memory, can extend indefinitely. There are 17 registers, these things labeled V, which he called variables, which is not what we mean by variable. He meant that the content of the register could change its number. The variables there, there are 17 there, and this machine is about 17 foot long. He spoke about machines, a minimum machine, an entry-level machine would have 100 variables, and he spoke of machines with 1,000 variables. He's talking about something the length of this room. So the conception in physical scale was massive. The logical conception, as we can see, was quite extraordinary. So information gets taken from the store under program control, sent to the central processor via buffer registers over there. That gets processed and sent back to the memory. So there's a fetch-execute cycle, there's a separation of memory and central processor, and those are just 3 of the features of it. It has an internal repertoire of instructions, so it can do 4-function arithmetic automatically, multiplication, division, and so on. So it embodies a set of logical and architectural features that we would now recognize as part of modern computing. Just to give some idea, I'll run through it. They may not mean a whole lot to some, they may mean more to others. It was programmable using punch card. It had microprogramming, automatic execution of a larger instruction by the automatic execution of smaller instructions, separation of store and mill we've spoken about, conditional control, if-then. It could take one or a number of routes in a calculation depending on the result of another calculation, and so on and so on. It had parallel processing and a parallel data bus. So all these features are explicit. These aren't wishful things. These aren't backwards projection for our own time. This isn't the coded vagueness of Nostradamus. These are in there. These are very specific design features. We can talk about Jacquard. He got the idea of punch cards from Jacquard, from the Jacquard loom. We see a Jacquard loom here. And that is the famous portrait of Jacquard woven in silk. It took 24,000 cards to make. It is so fine, it's often mistaken as an etching. And this has both cultural significance as well as technical significance. It was used by advocates for the industrial arts to show that subtlety, aesthetic subtlety, was not the exclusive province of a human agent. the translucency of the drapes up there and the shading, the subtle shading, was shown to be was used as an attempt to win acceptance for objects of industrial manufacture. So one of the points about jacquard, it wasn't just, okay, what the jacquard allowed you to do was to weave textiles with a pattern that is determined by the whole pattern on a bunch of punch cards. So the machine would read the punch cards. Now the point about this is a general machine for weaving. It doesn't weave anything specific. What is product specific about it is actually in the software. What is product specific? So you have the idea of a generalized machine, and what is functionally specific is not in the hardware, but actually in the software in the cards. So the loom is just much more than just a staging post for Babbage getting the idea about cards. It actually has kind of generic universality, the idea of a universal machine, where the functional specificity is provided from outside the machine, which is why the implications of the internal stored program are so profound. Because over here, it's all outside the machine. The functional specificity is outside it. So, we've got almost all of our core ideas, except one, and that is, there's a final step to go from where Babbage left things into modern computing. What is music but number clothed in sound? So the question now is, Babbage saw his machines as a new technology of mathematics. He never saw his machines as anything other than bounded by number. This is evident from both all his writings and a smoking gun quote which I found in his notebooks recently, which shows, even late in life, 2 years before he died, when he sets out to describe to the world his analytical engine, what he says its objects are all mathematical. He lists them, and they are all mathematical. So how did we get from a mathematical machine to a general-purpose computer? And the step there is the realization that number can represent entity other than quantity. That number can represent a note of music or letter of the alphabet. And that the power of computing comes from the representational power of number. So, if we've got a machine, a generalized machine, that can manipulate symbols according to rules, and the representational power of those symbols is to take aspects of the world, then we can manipulate those symbols and representations and produce knowledge of the world which was possibly not accessible by other means. And that is where the power of the machine comes. The generality of the general-purpose computer, which is that a machine for manipulating symbols according to rules, comes from that representational power of number and the ability for the machine to manipulate a symbol. Now, for Babbage, the machine was always manipulating a number, and the number didn't represent a symbol. It always represented a quantity. And that leap was made not by Babbage, but by Ada Lovelace, who met Babbage when she was 17 in 1833, and then subsequently in 1843 published a sketch of the analytical engine, her only publication, in which is the most penetrating account of the analytical engine in contemporary times of the time. And it's still studied to actually figure out what it is they did or didn't understand. But the idea that number can represent letters of the alphabet, notes of music, is actually is explicitly articulated in Lovelace's work. And this is not Lovelace making a suggestion. This is Lovelace banging the table, saying it is this that is significant about computers. And for everything else that has been said about her, she actually deserves recognition for this. She saw, in a sense, the implications. She may have been entirely mistaken, I believe, actually, that it may be she actually misunderstood what was going on with the analytical engine, that she believed it was capable of symbolic manipulation, that it could do algebra. Babbage didn't think it could do algebra. By algebra, we mean it can manipulate symbols regardless of its value and produce results in algebraic notation. Now, Lovelace clearly believed that the analytical engine was capable of doing it. It's not evident that it was. So it may be that she was smart, but the point is she made this imaginative leap and said, actually what's significant about a computer is its ability to manipulate symbols according to rule, and the power of the computer to our lives is the representational power of number that allows the machine to say things about the world which then get mapped back. So whether or not the grammar of the rules is the same as the grammar of the phenomena being modeled doesn't really matter. In many cases they are. They are mathematical models of physical processes, and the match there is exact. But you have the opportunity of simulation and modeling, which is the exploration of things in the world through the representational power of number. Right, the elephant in the room, of course, is assuming you would accept that these core ideas became evident in the 19th century, which is 100 years earlier than is commonly credited. So we associate those ideas, those 6 core ideas, with modern computation. And what I've tried to show is that actually they were all made explicit in the 19th century, almost without exception. Internal stored program was not. And so the elephant in the room is, to what extent did this influence modern computing? The implications are that it had very little influence, that the principles of computing, these core ideas amongst them, were reinvented by the pioneers of electronic computing, largely in ignorance of what had gone before. So that seems to be the conclusion. There are sort of weak threads, but the early designs cannot be held. The 19th century mechanics could not be held to be the DNA of modern computing. That level of detail wasn't known. So what we end up with is a very startling congruence. If it is the case that there was no influence, which seems very likely, what we end up is a rather extraordinary congruence between the ideas of the 19th century and the ideas of the modern computing age. And we are left with a conclusion, both reassuring and confining, that these ideas, articulated a century apart, embody something fundamental about the nature of computing. Thank you.